Thank you. Why don't we go ahead and see if we can get started so that we can respect everybody's time. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Mitch Landrieu. I used to be the mayor of the city of New Orleans. Now I'm just unemployed, and I'm moderating panels. So y'all had me downstairs trying to talk to you about something that I know nothing about, which is the National Democratic Party, but I know a little bit about cities. And we're here today to talk about the future of cities, not necessarily in the United States, but across the world. And the two people that are with us today have spent a huge amount of time not only thinking about this, but actually working in the most innovative ways across the world. So I want to welcome them. Thank you guys for coming. We have Dan Doctoroff, who is the CEO of an organization that is called Sidewalk Labs. He's going to tell you more about this. His company is working in Toronto on the riverfront to basically build a city out of thin air in a way that has not been built ever in the history of the world. And he is going to talk to you about that. Before that, Dan worked with Mike Bloomberg for Bloomberg LP, and then before that he worked for Mayor Bloomberg when they began to conceptualize the redesign and the redevelopment of New York, which, as you know, is one of the great cities in the world. So he's going to tell you a little bit about that. Sarah Moser is an assistant professor of geography at McGill University and the director of the university's urban studies program. She has spent a lot of time thinking about how cities are built from scratch. She focused her research on China's efforts to design new city projects, and she's doing a tremendous amount of work in Asia, thinking about and understanding what's happening with, I think, 150 new cities that are coming out of the ground. Before we start, I just want to make a couple of general comments. You know, a lot of the conversation that's going on here is about what's the United States going to do going forward. And as you may not have appreciated, most of the questions that are being asked about the federal government. What's happening with the State Department? Dr. Kissinger, what are you doing with the president or not? You know, what are the big issues of immigration, et cetera, et cetera? The mayors of the cities in America represent about 85% of the people that live in the United States of America. And most of the things we talk about deal with infrastructure, public health, transit, ways to solve old problems through new technology. We deal with climate change. We actually work in spaces where people live, practical realities, where ideas that we have hit the ground the next day, and then we hear about them really quickly about whether they work. So my wife Cheryl's here. From time to time, I will go to Langenstein's, which is a neighborhood place where we buy groceries in New Orleans. And by the time I get home, I get a bucket load of grief about what it is that I decided to do the next day. So if we decided to make a street a one-way a certain way, or make a smart street by creating a bike lane, or we did something relating to the sewer and water system, we're hearing it right away. How we communicate with each other, how we move, that's happening in cities all over the country. And the cities in America, for the most part, if I could posit this, are pretty small. Pretty small. New York, I think, has 8 million people in it. Chicago, approximate that. Los Angeles, New Orleans, 385,000 people. The cities in the world that are being built in Asia, in China, in other places, 20 million, 30 million. Bigger ways for people to move. And this entire discussion that's going on about what's happening in urban America, what's happening in rural America, where people work, what they do, how we respect each other's spaces, are all new problems, old problems that have been for a long time that we have to find new solutions for. And both of these folks are working on it. I had the great honor of helping rebuild a great American city from the ground. We like to think New Orleans is a hub for innovation and change, but guess what? Every city in America has become the laboratory for innovation and change, as well as cities around the world. And the mayors are the ones that are making that happen. Both of these folks know it. So with that, what I'd like to do, with your permission, is start off with Dan, talk about the work that he's doing in Toronto for a couple of minutes, and then turn it over to Sarah to talk about her work, and then receive questions from the audience if that meets with your approval. Is that okay? All right, so Dan, let's talk about what this crazy thing is you're doing in Toronto that is a little bit different from things that have happened in terms of how we build cities. And so can you just tell us a little bit, quick snapshot of your background, and then talk about Sidewalk Labs, how you guys got to Toronto, who conceptualized it, what you're trying to do, and the progress that you're making.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be here Jay Kriegel, asked that I come, and whenever he asks me to do anything, I do it. And so I'm really thrilled to be here. Frank, nice to see you. Let me just give you a little bit more on my background. Mitch gave you a tiny bit, but the last two phases of my career, as Mitch said, from very beginning of 2002 to 2008, I was deputy mayor of New York, responsible for everything sort of physical and financial in the city. So that included the rebuilding of the World Trade Center site, the regeneration of Brooklyn, the reconceptualization of the west side of Manhattan, including the High Line, and a lot of other stuff. And if you remember, New York, when Mike was elected, was literally still smoldering after 9/11, and people really questioned sort of the future of cities, and particularly a place like New York, which was founded effectively on the kind of premise that openness was a good thing. From there, I went and led for 7 years Bloomberg LP, which was the largest technology company in New York. And I thought I would stay there for a long time until Mike finished being mayor, was bored giving away money, and decided to start hanging around the company more. I realized at the end of the day it was just too hard to compete with God, because he really is like God at the company. And so I had to think about what I wanted to do next. I decided, I was going to go and do something else. And for a while, I had really been thinking about the future of cities. And been thinking about them in the context of, are we in fact at a unique moment in history when there's a set of technologies that are now available to us, including the fact that we're all connected, that there are sensors and data and ways of processing data that are really completely new, that are powering innovations across almost every urban system. And yet, at the end of the day, the cities really haven't changed much. In fact, if you look over the last 100 years, our cities really haven't changed much at all. We get our water the same way, we get our electricity basically the same way, we get around the same way, our apartments, with the exception of having the internet, basically function more or less in the same way. And I had this view that perhaps we were really ready for what I'd call a fourth urban technology revolution. The first three being the steam engine in the early part of the 19th century, the second being the electric grid in the later part of the 19th century, and the car, automobile, in the early part of the 20th century, all of which really have fundamentally shaped the modern city. But I said cities haven't changed much in almost 100 years. So I started thinking about this, and ironically, at the same time I was thinking about it, Larry Page, who is the founder of Google, had been thinking about it too. Larry, unbeknownst to me, is sort of a closet urbanist who thinks very deeply about urban issues. And he then reached out to me and said, what do you think about actually building a new city? And I, of course, thought that was crazy. But the more and more we talked, the more it actually had a little bit of logic to it. Larry, of course, is not one to easily doubt. This is the guy who said, I'm going to organize all of the world's information, and did it. Who basically said, you know what, I think cars actually can be made to be self-driving, and is doing it. And by the way, on the side, is inventing sort of a flying Uber, which is actually working. So I said, you know what, maybe I should take this kind of seriously. So about 3 years ago, we formed a company, and we is really me and Google, with Larry as kind of the driver at Google. to create this new company, Sidewalk Labs, and our mission is to build a city, really a district of a city that at scale can be a model for kind of what can happen when you truly combine cutting-edge innovation, largely based on sort of digital technologies, but goes way beyond that, and great urban design, all with the purpose of finding ways to dramatically improve the way people live in cities. Now, why do that at sort of a district scale? And what we're talking about is 100,000 people, you know, in basically 2 square miles, maybe half as many or 2/3 as many jobs. Why do that? Why is it worth it? And the answer is, and I'm sure Sarah will address this too, is that actually doing things in existing cities is really hard. But that doesn't mean that cities, as Mitch said, you know, aren't always looking for new ways of doing things to improve the way they deliver services and improve quality of life for their citizens. My view has always been that cities copy other cities and adapt them to sort of their own unique conditions. So as an example, in a non-technological way, back in 2008, when we actually opened the first section of the High Line, within a year, there were 36 High Lines under development all over the world. Bike share was basically first rolled out in Paris at scale. Today, there are over 1,000 cities with bike share. And so the feeling was that what we could do by showing the world an example, a model at scale where you look at every urban system together, mobility, infrastructure or sustainability, building innovation, a complete reinvention of the way kind of the public realm or parks and streets actually function, as well as community and social services, that if we were able to do this and document it and show the world what was possible, that in a very kind of interesting, unpredictable ways, cities around the world would be emboldened to adopt some of the approaches that we're taking and then hasten this 4th urban technology revolution. So we started off with a thought experiment. And the thought experiment was, what if you invented a city in the 21st century? What would it be? We brought people from all over the world together to talk about it. We looked at every single example of an attempt to actually build a 21st century city or a urban innovation district, not one of which, by the way, actually succeeded at all in its lofty ambitions. We cataloged every single possible innovation across all of those different urban systems, every company, every startup, and we eventually developed a concept for the city of the future that we thought would be adaptable to lots of other places. Now, in fairness, we were focused mostly on the developed world. And so we then said, you know, what we want to do is we actually want to find a place to do this. And so, again, we looked all over the developed world. We looked at hundreds of sites in many, many metropolitan areas, and ultimately decided to pick Toronto. Now, rather than Amazon, which basically bids cities against each other to get the best economic deal, and that's not a criticism of Amazon, we actually participated in a government-led process to actually pick a development and innovation partner. But we had identified Toronto and thought that it would be perfect, in part because, I don't know how many of you have actually spent much time there, but it's kind of a remarkable, relatively unknown here city. despite the fact that its basketball, baseball, and hockey teams actually compete against us, and the fact that it's literally an hour and 15-minute flight from New York. So why do we pick Toronto? We picked Toronto for a couple of reasons. One, they have an incredible site on the waterfront that is 800 acres, which is roughly the size of Central Park. That is a mile from downtown Toronto, but is a wasteland. Essentially, it was a product of a failed industrial strategy from 100 years ago. Second, there's an entity, a governmental entity, that in turn has three stakeholders who are the three levels of government who's been developing the waterfront for 15 years. Third, there is a fabulous urbanist tradition in Toronto. It was not lost on us that Jane Jacobs, the greatest urbanist of them all, arguably, fled New York for Toronto, describing Toronto as the most hopeful city in North America. They have a great technology ecosystem that's growing, but the real reason was much more subtle. And the real reason is that Toronto actually believes in a value that is really important. They believe in inclusivity. They believe in openness. And that fact has led them, much to my surprise, to be the most diverse city in North America, maybe in the world. 52% of all Torontonians were born outside of Canada. 52%. New York only is 40.
Sounds like they have an immigration problem.
Well, this is the irony.
Just kidding for anybody.
No, but this is the actual irony, which is why we ultimately picked them. They're not only the most diverse, they're actually also the fastest growing large city in North America because of their openness. But what's happened is that the paradox is that because they are growing so fast, because they haven't been able to accommodate that growth, there is a massive affordability problem. Right. There is a massive mobility challenge. And as a result, even more than in a place like New York, people who without means are getting pushed further and further away from the centers of opportunity. And so what you've got is this growing dissonance between values and the reality that we thought would actually make them much more open to trying a new approach, particularly a new approach to managing the consequences of growth, which ironically in their case were due to the fact that they're so open. Really interesting problem. So we've been working for the last year or so with Toronto, all three levels of government, to develop a plan for this waterfront that is based on our original conception. And I want to describe a little bit what it is, and then we can talk.
Can you do that in about 2 minutes?
I can do that easily in 2 minutes. The first is there would be no actual traditional vehicles there. It'll all be self-driving vehicles. When you do that, you can completely reconceive of the public open space. You can capture back almost twice as much open space, putting people literally within steps of an open space. We've rethought the notion of buildings. Our assumption in this place is that virtually all of the buildings, which can be mid and high rise, will be made basically of wood instead of concrete and steel. The pavement in this place will be dynamic so that we can use the roads based on data much more efficiently and obviously much more safely. We will actually completely rethink social services in this place and community services to make them more personalized and more adaptable. So there's a lot to this, but the interesting question is, what will it actually feel like when you actually live there? And we believe that at the end of the day, well, yes, it will be cheaper. We think it'll be the most sustainable place in the world. We believe that at the end of the day, it will be safe, So it'll connect people to community in new ways, but the way it'll feel will be almost like a 21st century urban village, hyper dynamic, very diverse, very mixed use, almost like if you picture, Mulberry Street or something like that in the early 20th century before there were cars, and you've got that sense of this incredible energy on the streets. By the way, in Toronto, aided by really sophisticated new approaches to mitigating weather outside. That's what we think it'll be without all the negative friction that you would have found in a city 100 years ago.
Can I interrupt you if you wouldn't mind? Because I know time is important. I wanted Sarah to get a chance to give another view from another different part of the world, and then get everybody in the audience to chew on a couple of questions that I think they're going to ask you, which is, you talked about technology and data. The more of that you have, the more efficient the city is going to be, but how's that going to bust up against civil liberties and openness and transparency? The idea sounds great, but what's going to happen is when you put real humans in it and they mess it up and walk across the street the wrong way, and really how it's going to live and how it's going to breathe. Also, just the relationship between function and design and the effectiveness and then the timeline. And we'll get to that. I'm sure you have some questions as well. But I want to ask Sarah to talk a little bit about the work that she's doing in Asia. We talked in the green room just a minute ago. She said there are 130 really massive cities that are being built across the world, a lot faster and more quickly than the kind of things you see happen in the cities that all of us live in. But Sarah, if you can just give us a little sense of the work that you've been doing.
Sure. I mean, I have a lot of visuals, so please check the screens. I think many of you have heard of new master plan cities, but probably assume it's something happening more in the 1960s with Brasilia, Chandigarh. These are state-driven and publicly funded projects. They are infused with socialist ideas. So very different than what we see today in new cities. So this is just an indication of the new city projects emerging around the world. There's between 130 and 150 new master plan cities in over 40 countries, primarily in the global south. So I do work in Saudi Arabia and Indonesia, Malaysia, and parts of Africa. Okay, I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour through the new city trends. The key actors 50 to 100 years ago was the US and Western Europe, essentially. They were driving new city projects. Today, you see all sorts of other actors building new cities. South Korea, Malaysia, Morocco, Russia, China, the UAE, Singapore. These are all kind of new actors who are getting involved in the new city business. So the global north really does not have a monopoly on this urban expertise or urban experimentation. And I would say the vast majority is happening elsewhere. What we're also seeing is the corporatization of urban space and governance. And this has really intensified in the last 10 years or so. 100% of new cities have CEOs. They don't have mayors. They don't have elected city councils. 100% of CEOs of new cities are men. This is a man's world. You add new cities plus technology, 100% male-dominated. An extreme case scenario is King Abdullah Economic City in Saudi Arabia, which is a company. It's a publicly traded company listed on the Saudi Stock Exchange. So the city is owned primarily by non-residents. And here we have the CEO, Fadel Rashid, who has an MBA from Stanford. We're also seeing the growing role of the private sector and technology companies. New types and scales of public-private partnerships that we've never seen on this level. We're seeing the subversion of democratic processes around the world. We're seeing sweetheart deals between companies and governments at an unprecedented scope. With little to no public consultation and very little accountability to the public. So who's getting involved in all of these projects? There's money to be made here. IBM, Cisco, Google, Facebook, Bill Gates, everyone's getting on board the new city train. Cisco estimates they stand to make at least $40 billion in the coming decades from new city projects. I have to say the vast majority are PowerPoint cities. They exist only in PowerPoint slides and websites. So the dark blue is cities that have been planned but not really started. Okay, we're also seeing a lot of new cities being designed to be new capitals of countries or at the state, provincial level. So this is Putrajaya, the new capital of Malaysia. We're also seeing a lot of new cities being constructed, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, that are basically gated retreats for the wealthy, to retreat from the existing chaos of existing cities. Rather than fixing the existing cities, it's actually easier to find a plot of empty land, and all the wealthy can live there. So this is Echo Atlantic in Nigeria. New cities are also a key strategy to transition away from oil economies. So you're seeing new cities all over the Middle East that are being constructed in the hopes that there will be other industries when the oil starts to run its course. So Saudi Arabia is building 5 new cities, Kuwait is building 12, Bahrain is getting in the game, Oman, et cetera, et cetera. This is King Abdullah Economic City in Saudi Arabia, which you see will be very green indeed, golf courses and coconut trees, et cetera. There's no water in King Abdullah Economic City, so 100% of the water comes from desalination plants. So what fuels desalination plants? Oil. So these are not exactly green cities. They're the color green, but not eco. This is Masdar in Abu Dhabi, which I would say image management is a key factor in this project. It helps us forget that Abu Dhabi uses the most energy per capita. They produce the most solid waste per capita in the world, and that they have 8% of the world's known oil. So creating an eco-city like Masdar, which the goal was to be carbon neutral, starts to change the conversation a bit. That's the goal. It's also an urban laboratory, much like the Sidewalk Labs. What we're seeing is also that these new cities are being constructed for national glory. Lusail in Qatar is being built to host the FIFA World Cup in 2022. Doha is not hosting it. It is actually Lusail, which the target population of which is 300,000. Of course, many of these are real estate ventures. Real estate globally is a prime investment vehicle. And so we're seeing this. This is an extreme case scenario in Sabah Al Ahmed Sea City in Kuwait. They have made canals 6 miles inland from the ocean. So everybody has waterfront property. This is the 2002 satellite image in 2016. And it's really happening. This is a photo of it. And so interestingly, this is increasing vulnerability to climate change because 30 to 40% of all new cities are built on the sea. And finally, a lot of these new cities are built with the intention of leapfrogging national economies from agriculture into high tech. And Yachay City of Knowledge in Ecuador is one of many such projects. Sort of the Silicon Valley of Latin America, that's what the goal is. Okay, and finally, what I'm going to be focusing on in the rest of the presentation is our new cities as a geopolitical strategy. And no one does it better than China. This is for a city in Malaysia. This is the model of it. This is not the photo of the project. So for a city in Malaysia is, it's right between, let me see if I can, no, you can't see that. It's right between Singapore and Malaysia, being constructed in the territorial waters of Malaysia. So you can sort of see it, I actually can't point. It's located in the narrow strait between Malaysia and Singapore at a strategic choke point along one of the world's busiest shipping routes. So that route on the left between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula has about 100,000 ships pass through it per year. accounting for about 25% of the world's shipping and 25% of oil shipped between the Middle East and China. So it's a very significant place. The strait, at its narrowest, is 1.5 miles wide. Yeah. And this is where Forest City and an accompanying Chinese port are being constructed. Okay, you can see a little triangle up there. That's Forest City. Oops. Yep, so in 2014, massive land reclamation activities began in Malaysian territorial waters. Forest City is emerging from the sea, destroying mangrove forests and displacing coastal Malay villages. As far as you can see, it's land reclamation. And where do they get the land from? They scrape the bottom of the ocean and then dump it onto the islands, or they grab sand from other locations and truck it in and dump it. Not super eco. Okay. So the project is a gated private city for 700,000 people. Strategically located just 2 kilometers off the coast of Singapore, which is the strongest economy and largest port in Southeast Asia. And you can see up at the top the Tanjung Pelepas port, which is the new Chinese port. So Forest City is owned and constructed by a private Chinese company on 4 massive landfill islands that are in the process of being created. And it aspires to be a prime model for future cities and to reinvent urban living in a car-free, smart eco-city with vertical greening. Sounds great. Okay, so I'm on the beach in front of the hotel, the one hotel that's open in Forest City, and I'm looking at Singapore. All of that land, the city is Singapore.
It's a lot of grain.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so the current population is about 50. They've just had the first key handing over ceremony for the first condo. 100% of the buyers are Chinese, which is no surprise. The target population is 700,000. The estimated cost is $100 billion. They expect all the units to sell, but they expect that the estimated full-time occupancy will only be 30%, and the rest will be empty investment condos or vacation rentals. Yeah, 100% of the project is land reclamation. Okay, so there's a superstructure that covers the island, and all the cars are underground. So the promotional material refers to Forest City as a pride and dream paradise for all mankind, and features green lawns, golf courses, manicured gardens, etc. So the superstructure covers all 4 islands, and so the parking and transportation corridors are all underground. All right, this is an actual photo, not a model. And this is back to the model. The project is about the size of 5 central parks, and if it's constructed according to plan, it'll be the densest place on Earth.
What?
Densest place on Earth.
So let me ask you, just if I could just hold for a second, because we have about 17 minutes left. What I'm hearing Dan say, and the work that they're doing, is this is going to be a new, exciting, great project, and you're saying not so fast. This is happening all over the world. There are lots of things to be nervous about. In a general way. I know maybe some of you have questions, but maybe you could both address just briefly, because we need to get to questions. Just that tension between having to find new spaces for people to live in ways that are eco-friendly, that are smart, that use data, what the challenges are with technology and civil liberties, and then finally the issue that you addressed about how private companies are sucking up public space, carting them off for people that have money, and then keeping people out, generally, that otherwise aren't going to have access to them. I think there are going to be some tensions with that going forward. Why don't you just about 2 minutes each, and then we'll go to questions.
Let me first say, there's nothing that Sarah said that I disagree with. I think virtually every single one of these projects is, in many different ways, misconceived, misgoverned, et cetera. What we're trying to do is something completely in partnership with a democratic government, done through a democratic process. We will have literally like 100 this year public events to talk about the plans and revise them so that they're really of the people of Toronto for the people of Toronto. I would also point out that in terms of governance, it's still going to be a part of the city of Toronto. Our role, in fact, is really to enable this to actually happen. I also point out that one of the commitments that we've made from the very beginning is that the place that we create with the governments, all three governments together, is going to be diverse. That has been a commitment from the very beginning.
How are you really going to walk that walk and make sure that this small space is available to everybody?
Because the government actually owns the vast majority of the land, so we can actually place constraints on affordability and other things. So that's part of the actual plan, which makes it very different. I do want to talk about questions.
Let me ask you one other question.
Yeah.
And then also, how are you going to, with all of the data you're going to collect on every touch point that every human being touches that you can collect, how then are you going to protect people's civil liberties without sharing that data?
We don't actually feel, and this will be very surprising for a company that is affiliated with Google, we don't even feel like we have to own the data ourselves. So one of the concepts that we're talking about pioneering is a trust that will be, in effect, publicly owned, that will actually own the data itself, and that whatever this place uses, will be done per agreement with that trust, as an example. So we all recognize that data, particularly data in public spaces or your own personal data, it's the Wild West out there. We're giving away so much, and nobody has any control over it whatsoever. We actually think that by having a great public conversation about this, by developing policies that actually may set a global standard, a big part of the contribution we can make is to rethink the way data is actually used. Now, most of the data isn't really about individuals. In fact, the vast majority here doesn't need to be about individuals. If we want to change a street, the direction of a street, we don't actually need to know who anybody is and do that dynamically. If we want to have aprons on buildings that provide shade or warmth from harsh weather conditions, we just need climatic data in order to tell us when to do that in order to save energy or kind of do something more efficiently. So most of what the data will not be personal, and to the extent that there is data set, it's going to be owned in a different vehicle than most people would expect. So this is a foundational issue, something that's really critical, something that's a problem in the world, and we think we're going to pioneer a new solution through a completely democratic process.
Thank you for that. I wish we could spend a long time on this. So we have questions. We have our volunteers here. Can you walk over to, if someone wants to? Yes, sir. Frank? And then
yes,
there's a microphone there, Frank.
Right.
Thank you.
Absent
we have about 11 minutes left.
Absent from both of your descriptions of Toronto and the multiplicity of cities you're looking at is one word: sea rise, climate change. How are you thinking about the challenge of sea rise and climate change as you plan forward into the development of the cities?
Well, do you want to go take that? I can tell you how we're planning to do it in Toronto. Toronto's on a lake, so it's actually not a big problem. But the site itself has a big problem with potential flooding. And so the 3 levels of government have already allocated over $1 billion to basically restructure the site in order to, in effect, enable the runoff from potential flooding to run out into the lake. It's a big problem in many of these other places, but in Toronto, it's actually climate change is not a huge issue.
Thank you, Dan. Sarah, you want to?
I mean, I came up with this list of new cities, and I crunched the numbers, and my estimation is 30 to 40% of them are on the sea, and that means about 20+ million people living in them at risk.
Will be at risk, and they're not planning for them at all, I heard you say. Yes, ma'am.
I think one of the great philosophies that Jane Jacobs has was that cities are so interesting because they sort of grow up higgledy-piggledy. And they are wood, they're concrete, they're brick, they're steel. Things are not always at right angles to each other. And most planned communities end up looking very sterile, and particularly if they're all built out of the same material. Why would you choose just wood, and how would you try to affect something that is interesting and diverse in the same way that you hope the population will be?
First of all, I don't think everything will be wood, but one of the reasons we think wood is interesting is that wood actually can be developed in a way that enables it to actually be assembled in a much cheaper way, which can drive down the cost of building, we think, by 20 to 25% at scale. And when we can drive down the cost, we can obviously make it dramatically more affordable and therefore accessible for many more people. But it won't be just wood. I want to address the more important point that you raised, which is about sort of over-planning things. Our view of this is that we shouldn't plan the whole thing. That in fact, sort of the major breakthrough that we had about this place is that it should be a little bit more like a platform, is part of a techno word, but one that's quite relevant. A platform is something where you create the conditions and enable other people to build on top of it as tastes, technologies, trends, or whatever evolve. A great, I think, analogy to that is really the smartphone. So if you think about your smartphone or people's smartphones, you know, if you think about, say, what Apple did, they created a very elegant device, right? So that was hardware and it was software. They created design standards for it. They created ways of others to connect into it that were standard and easier to use. But what made the smartphone magical is the fact that there are now millions of app developers out there using the tools, using that platform to make it their own or provide services that no one ever dreamed about. That's what makes it magical. We see the city as a platform in basically the same way, that it has to be able to evolve because that's what makes cities great, is people making them their own.
When the humans start using them. We'll see. Yes, sir. Right there. Yes, sir.
Actually, for Dan. If you could talk about the hurdles that you have to face as it pertains to when you could deliver in terms of entitlements, new construction methods that I'm sure come up against existing construction codes, as well as labor unions.
Yeah, so in terms of the process, so we're developing the plan now. We're doing this completely in partnership with government. We hope to have that done very early next year. Part of the plan, there's a physical plan to it that sort of sets the construct. There's an innovation agenda. That innovation agenda is going to require a set of regulatory or legislative forbearances in order to do some of the things we want to do. We're already working with the public sector, the civil servants, on beginning to define what those things are. Preparing for either regulatory approvals or legislative approvals, hopefully next year, to be able to actually start construction ideally in 2020. But there'll be a long list of things, some of which we'll need to do earlier, some of which we'll need to do later on, and that's all part of the actual plan itself. And those things, as I said, do range for permitting for things like wood buildings or creating over time a special innovation zone that would give special ability. But it also includes things like how are we going to find the money for affordable housing, because that's a very important part of this.
We're gonna give the chief, Ben Rosen, the microphone.
A question for Sarah.
Susan, I'll come to you.
Sarah, there's a map you have, I know, that you didn't show, that shows the neocolonialism of China in a better perspective, where it shows all the cities from Singapore to Africa. where China is surrounding the whole Indian Ocean with new cities, except none by coincidence in India. And could you describe what they're doing and whether there is a political aspect to this?
Sure. So I think it would probably be easiest if I just finish my 2 final slides. There are 5 key dimensions of Forest City that I think we need to be looking at. The ocean is a new frontier for urbanization and colonization. What we're looking at in the case of these Chinese cities being built in the ocean is the disassembling of national territory. What I didn't have a chance to mention was that Malaysia has conceded sovereignty to the Chinese in Forest City. So Chinese military, Malaysian military and police are not allowed into the project. In a private gated city run by a Chinese corporation backed by the Chinese state, will Malaysian laws apply? If someone kills someone, what happens? Producing social spatial inequalities on a massive scale and foreign race-based enclaves seems to be a growing trend. And this is part of, I'm arguing that this is part of China's broader geopolitical strategy and represents the expansion of Chinese de facto territory. And then we get to, okay, and this is also about a lot of greenwashing to mask the motives here, cover everything with green walls and it depoliticizes it. So what we're looking at are projects. The dots represent new city/port projects that China's building across the South China Sea and across the Indian Ocean, all the way to China's first military base in Africa, in Djibouti. And you can sort of see all the countries that are building or hosting these new projects, and they do form sort of a ring around India: Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Myanmar, Oman, etc. So the broader geopolitical aspect, I think, should be examined.
Well, very much so. All right, Susan? Yes, sir. I'm sorry, Peter, and then...
We talked at lunch. I'd love you to tell them a little bit about being a woman in this man's world where 100% are men, and you come in as a woman from the Western world to there.
Yeah, it's an adventure. I work in Saudi Arabia and Indonesia and Malaysia, but I also work in it's a man's world everywhere. It's a man's world in North America. In one respect, I fly under the radar because they look at me and think, oh, this is no threat. And then they just talk very freely in front of me. So I've interviewed dozens of CEOs of new cities, and oftentimes they spill the beans in a way that they might not spill to a man. Other times I sort of get talked down to or talked over, which I can handle. It's not that big a deal. I mean, I work in Saudi Arabia, but I've had no major problems. I just make sure I cover up, and I'm fine.
You speak Arabic?
No, I speak Malay and Indonesian. Yeah.
Really? Wow. Okay, Peter, and then John. Peter, would you the microphone, please? Thank you.
Have you considered graphite, the notion of graphite in the buildings or whatever it is, which are theoretically supposed to be carbon negative in the scheme of the importance of sustainability?
The answer is no.
It's new stuff. But
yeah.
All right. Yes, John? I'm sorry. He's right behind you. There we go.
So in the envisioning and creation of new cities, what are the assumptions about what make human beings content? And how do we create an environment where that can
I'm from New Orleans. That's easy. Good food, good music. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's interesting from our perspective if there is, it's interesting to use the word content, because if there's one overriding sort of way in which we'll evaluate how we're doing, it is whether people are happy. Which is the kind of, I think, the fundamental human driver. Now, what makes people happy? Obviously, everybody's different, but I think it boils down to a fairly common set of quality of life attributes that are the basis upon which we will ultimately evaluate how we're doing. Cost of living is one. Can you live a lifestyle kind of without undue economic pressure? We, by the way, think that we can reduce the cost of living in this place by about 15% compared to the surrounding metropolitan area. Safety, environmental performance, convenience, how much time do time-starved people get back in their day. But I think it's beyond that. It is about fairness and access to opportunity are critical for us as well. So each one of those things actually are kind of the drivers for us. You know, at the end of the day, with the way we look at it, technology is just a means to an end. And the end is ultimately bending the curve on these quality of life metrics. That is ultimately what we are trying to do here. Our number one objective is to try and improve quality of life in a way that can be seen by other places and in parts relevant to them, adopted by them. And if we are able to do that, we will make an enormous contribution to civilization. And that's what's really driving us.
Sarah, you want to address that?
I do. In the 150 cities that I've studied and cataloged, I'm really shocked by the difference between the cities and what they think is ideal. In some cases, it's extremely low-density suburbs where everyone has a high wall around their fence. In other places, they don't want to live next to anyone who's poorer than them. In many cases, they don't want to live next to someone of another ethnicity or another religion. And I'm starting to see that the ideal for many people is an ethnic enclave where they live with people who are just like them, from a similar socioeconomic bracket, from a similar, ethnic background. It's a little bit depressing, but this seems to be the trend that I'm seeing around the world.
Thank you.
And it's hard work. I just have to say, it's hard work to get very different people to feel motivated to live together. And that planners often have the best intentions, and then they can't sell units when it comes right down to it.
Yeah, we're so running out of time. I can just take, yes ma'am, you right there, and then Susan, I'm sorry I can't get to. I think those would be our last two, because they're cutting me off. They're giving me the yank.
Okay, this will be really quick.
Helen,
thank you both so much. All three of you are very aware of what a challenge it is to do waste collection in cities. And I'm interested if you've seen any best practices in terms of waste collection, recycling, compost in your future cities.
Nope. Honestly, I think the best examples are coming out of well-established cities. It was Toronto that pioneered the blue box system in 1975. Our existing cities with strong communities and strong, active, vocal members of society come up with the best ideas. They're not coming from new cities.
We think we can meaningfully improve on that. And we've looked at sort of every element of the waste stream, including what happens in a multifamily building when you actually throw the waste down the chute. We've actually developed the beginnings of a smart chute that can measure it and then incentivize it. What happens when you have organic waste, how you actually begin to dramatically reduce the amount of it with things called anabolic digesters, the ability to cart it away in a much more efficient, probably underground method. So we sort of looked at every step, and there's not one best practice, but there's lots of new technologies and approaches that we think can be combined to dramatically reduce the amount of the waste stream.
Thank you, Dan. This is the last question. You guys, I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
Wow, that was very nice. It's like the White House press room. How do you do that?
So with so many of present-day cities and major cities having so many poor and cramped areas with residents living so close to each other, why do you think that so many of these new cities are focused on the wealthier classes and targeted towards those?
That's for you, Sarah.
Money talks.
Money.
Yeah. It's money, but I think there's room to densify a lot of these cities. Actually, when you look at the numbers, For example, Kuala Lumpur kept saying, we're so dense, we're overcrowded, we're huge, we have to build a new city. That's how they legitimized this massive project. But it's actually had lower density and smaller than Vancouver. So it's a lot of smoke and mirrors, I think.
Yes, ma'am. Who did you want me to take? Yes, ma'am. I'm not the bossy. I'm like a puppet on a string. They told me I was out of time. We'll stay. Let's just stay all night.
Can you explain why self-driving cars open up so much free space?
So yeah, it's a great question. So in a, it's self-driving and shared. Okay. So now when I say shared, I don't mean like everyone sits in a car together. What I mean is they're owned, collectively, effectively. But it's both. So if you think about an average city, 30 to 40% of a city's land is dedicated to parking and to roadways, particularly the separation of roadways, because we need to separate pedestrians from cyclists from cars, right? Because they're unsafe. Self-driving vehicles will be dramatically safer. I think that's pretty well established. The second fact that's important to know is the average vehicle is only driven 3% of the time. So if you can actually create a mobility system that enables people to use a common resource where they actually are safer and therefore you can carve back the amount and you don't need nearly as much parking, our belief is you can double the amount of open space relative to the comparable area surrounding it.
All right, you guys, I'm going to exercise my authority as the no authority to end this beautiful discussion. Thank you all so much. And they both have books. Dan's got a book, Sarah's got a book. Go buy them.